In the following episode, we will hear distressing accounts of abuse, violence, rape, and eating disorders. These subjects are part of conversations that I believe we must engage with, but can be very difficult to listen to. Please take care.
And you never know what's going to happen or when it's going to happen. I've been told, and I hate to say this because, war is awful, but that victim survivors, it's like war.
This is Bridget. Bridget isn't her real name, but we're using it to protect her safety. Bridget is talking about her experience of domestic abuse. A short while ago, Bridget fled from the US with her 2 teenage children to the UK to escape her ex-partner and start a new life. To the outside world, the comparison between war and abuse might feel a bit off-kilter. One is a sprawling public event, often involving entire nations, reported on and recorded in meticulous detail, while the other exists in the private, domestic sphere, between 2 people, hidden from the world, often doubted and undermined. Those on the front lines of war are deemed heroes, fighting for a cause that either they believe in or on behalf of someone who does. Or they are innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. Victims of abuse, however, are often perceived as somehow culpable in their own circumstances. Yet despite the differences, perceived or real, the survivor of war and the survivor of abuse share a fundamental, life-changing experience. Trauma. Trauma caused by the unpredictability, the constant threat, and the terror.
You're walking through a minefield and you know that things are going to go off and you just don't know when.
Ever since trauma began to be understood after the First World War, it was believed to be something that only happened to soldiers. And soldiers were men. Yet that started to change in the 1970s. The women's liberation movement demanded that women's mental health be taken as seriously as men's and given the same level of investigation and validation. This shift, wrote the acclaimed American psychiatrist Judith Lewis Herman, led to the understanding that the most common post-traumatic disorders are those not of men in war, but women in civilian life. Building on the work of second-wave feminists, Herman's seminal 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery, which we came across in episode 1, ushered in a new understanding of the psychological impact of violence against women in all its devastating severity. Notably, this included her creation of a new diagnosis, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. Symptoms of CPTSD include shame, guilt, self-blame, amnesia, suicidal ideation, anger, isolation and withdrawal, and a sense of hopelessness and despair. The diagnosis, Herman argued, was about offering recognition to those who had endured exploitation over a long period of time, often years. It was, she wrote, an attempt to learn from survivors who understand more profoundly than any investigator the effects of captivity. When Bridget left her partner, she was diagnosed with CPTSD.
He had a certain car, and when I would see a car with the same headlights, I would get nervous. And even here in another country, when I rationally know that his car is not here, that's the hardest thing with CPTSD. Rationally, I know I'm safe. I could say all the reasons why this doesn't make sense, but trauma is stored in the body. And so it's a body reaction. It happens automatically, so you can't control it.
Just like she couldn't control what was happening in her brain.
My prefrontal cortex shut down. I couldn't think. I'm trying to take care of the kids, keep normalcy as much as possible. I'm trying to use the resources that I could. You're full on in crisis mode, just trying to survive.
The prefrontal cortex is the home of our cognitive actions, like decision-making and reasoned thinking. Yet the brain shuts it down when it is experiencing extreme stress. It does this so it can focus on just one thing: staying alive. My name is Marisa Bate. I'm a feminist journalist who reports on the lives of women, and this is Echoes of Harm, a podcast by Cora Media in collaboration with Angelini Pharma. In 1980, when post-traumatic stress disorder was first included in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic Manual, a guide to all mental health conditions, traumatic events were described as outside the range of usual human experience. We know now just how wrong they were. In 2022, a report from the European Institute for Gender Equality found that almost 1 in 2 women in the EU have experienced coercive control or psychological violence, which can lead to PTSD or CPTSD. In fact, it's so firmly inside the range of usual human experience that some countries have now made it a crime. In 2015, England and Wales became the first countries in the world to make coercive controlling behaviour illegal. Again, according to the European Institute for Gender Equality, 5 member states, Ireland, Denmark, Spain, France and Hungary, have criminal legislation specific to psychological violence or coercive control. Yet, as survivors like Bridget know, proving coercive controlling behaviour can be extremely difficult, not least because victims themselves can't always recognise when it takes place.
I was in denial for a lot of it. One time I was held in the bedroom and he took my keys and my phone. And that moment, when I finally was able to leave, I got in my car and it was raining. And I sat in a parking lot and I called the domestic abuse hotline. I remember shaking and saying to myself, how did this happen to me? That was the moment I realized I needed help.
Bridget would remain in the relationship for the next 7 years. According to the British charity Refuge, it takes on average 7 attempts before a woman can leave for good. That works out as 1 a year for Bridget. However, she might have stayed for longer had she known what was coming.
I feel lucky that I didn't know how brutal the post-separation abuse would be.
Post-separation abuse refers to when perpetrators use institutions and systems, such as the police, the criminal justice system, child maintenance payments, or social services, to continue to abuse and exert control over victims. When we began making this podcast, Bridget told me that it was this form of abuse that she wanted to raise awareness around, to let people know just how catastrophic and traumatic the abuse that continues after a relationship has finished can be, often enacted through the very people that are meant to be helping her. I want to interject and say something here. While it is absolutely crucial to raise awareness around post-separation abuse, so that institutions can avoid, even unintentionally, causing further harm to victims and being misled by abusers, it is just as crucial to stress that nothing is as bad as the torment of remaining in the relationship with the abuser. For some, asking for help to leave is the only way to survive. Rebuilding a life after abuse can be extremely challenging, but the countless survivors I've met all tell me the same thing. It was the best thing they've ever done. They just wish they'd done it sooner. And yet it is still important to understand exactly how post-separation abuse operates. Sometimes, due to a lack of understanding or training, institutions can unintentionally support and protect domestic abusers. Their procedures and their treatment of victims when they are seeking safety and justice can feel like another form of harm. And this comes in addition to how an abuser can take advantage of these systems for their own benefits. For Bridget, it's been a nightmare. Her ex-partner has breached a restraining order and the police just let him off. He's refused to follow court orders and his lawyer demanded she undergo psychological testing, which she had to pay to fight. The judge threw it out right away, recognising it for what it was, an abuse tactic. But even then, Bridget was stuck covering the legal costs. On top of that, there's endless paperwork, applying for help, sorting out finances, dealing with solicitors, all while she's barely holding on with CPTSD. Her ex weaponizes the system through coercive control, dragging out legal battles, and creates conflict at every turn. It's a constant cycle that piles on crippling costs that amount to the same price as buying a house, she told me. And the worst part? It keeps him in her life. This relentless abuse prolongs the trauma and robs her of the peace she and her children deserve.
And so you're trying to break away, you're trying to start over your life, and you keep getting pulled back because you have these systems in place that are saying, nope, you've got to share, nope, he gets another chance, oh, so what, he didn't file his paperwork.
And so the trauma continues.
And then when you're in court and the financial and the legal abuse is all consuming, I lost my work. I couldn't work. I was on government assistance. I was in trauma therapy twice a week. My kids were in therapy. You have hypervigilance. Like anytime I heard a car, I was like checking my window at night. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I was obsessed with reading every precedent case about keeping the children safe.
And much how coercive controlling behavior works within a relationship, Bridget soon realized there was also a pattern to the post-separation abuse too.
When I left, I started being able to track these patterns because I needed to be able to show the courts and also myself and start predicting what would happen. So at one point, I literally took a big poster board paper and I wrote every single day of the year for 2 years. And I color-coded patterns of behavior so that I could start looking back and seeing when we had a court date coming up, this is what would happen. And it's very predictable.
Yet despite all of these challenges and the emotional and financial costs that comes with leaving, Bridget has no regrets.
You cannot underestimate the freedom and the peace that you feel even in the challenging moments. There is a daily peace, and eventually I can promise them that the headspace where 95% of your thoughts came back to this relationship and everything, that goes away. And now I go weeks without even contemplating who he is or what he's doing. And I never thought that would happen.
It wasn't just Bridget who felt the impact of the abuse, both during and after the relationship.
My daughter developed a stutter. My kids had anxiety. My son, when he would be on the football field, he didn't have, his adrenaline and cortisol wasn't functioning. He was in freeze.
According to UNICEF, about 133 to 275 million children are exposed to or witness domestic abuse around the world and are the forgotten victims of violence in the home. They too experience profound psychological impact. As we heard in the first episode from Dr. Anita Rischler-Rossler, Professor Emerita of Psychiatry and Psychotherapy at the University of Basel, the impact can begin in the womb. And even with access to therapy, the impact can stay with them throughout adulthood. As children, regardless of if they are directly abused themselves or if they witness the abuse, they can face self-esteem issues, learning difficulties, and have limited social skills. When they become adults, they are at a higher risk of becoming perpetrators or victims themselves and developing substance abuse issues. The Council of Europe has stated, every single child exposed to violence at home reacts differently, but witnessing violence against their mother is, in all cases, a form of psychological abuse which has potentially severe consequences. A good friend of mine experienced domestic abuse as a child. Now 39, she's on her 4th therapist. She jumps out of her skin when a door slams and can't watch thrillers or any dramas with suspense. Her brother is a drug addict. It is, she's told me, a life sentence. As you might have guessed by now, Bridget is intelligent and articulate. Back in the States, she was extremely successful, confident, highly educated, and a committed member of the community. But despite all of that, and like a lot of victims, Bridget has felt deep shame at her situation.
I was an activist and an advocate, and I did a lot in the community, and I fought for inequality and injustice. And yet, in my life, I felt such shame because I was in what I thought was just a toxic relationship.
Shame. It's a word that has consumed the world's media in the last year due to the trial of Dominique Pellicot in France. Pellicot was found guilty of drugging and raping his wife, Giselle, when she was unconscious, and inviting over 50 men he met online to do the same, each time filming the assaults. The abuse went on for over a decade, and the constant drugging led Giselle's children to suspect Giselle had developed a neurological condition. Giselle Pellicot's decision to have an open trial and invite the world's media was met with universal applause. She did this, she said, to try and change the culture. She did this, she said, because shame must change sides. This became a rallying call to women around the world, graffitied on walls and painted on banners held by the women who came to support Giselle during the trial. Of course, Giselle Pellicot is right. The shame must belong to the perpetrators, not the victims. But where does a woman's shame come from? Let's return to the Diagnostic Manual for the American Psychiatric Association, or DSM-5 as it is more commonly known, the standard guide for all mental health conditions used by medical professionals. The one that first introduced post-traumatic stress disorder that we came across earlier in the episode. Now it's the mid-1980s and it's up for revision. Professionals can submit new disorders for consideration. According to Judith Lewis Herman's book, a group of male psychoanalysts came up with something they called masochistic personality disorder. This, they claimed, applied to anyone who remains in relationships in which others exploit, abuse, or take advantage of him or her, despite opportunities to alter the situation. Put bluntly, this group of men believe there must be something psychologically deficient with a victim to stay in an abusive relationship. And chillingly, that there must be part of their psyche that actively wants to be abused, with no mention whatsoever of the perpetrator's actions or responsibility. Their response to the misinformed question of why didn't she leave seemed to be, there must be something wrong with her. Or worse, she might even like it. The victim blaming was breathtaking, and the backlash was immediate. The name was changed, and the so-called disorder was relegated to an appendix, thankfully lost in history. Yet it serves to highlight a long-standing culture of victim blaming, one that is alive and well today. Yet this isn't the only reason women feel shame. Dr. Anita Rischler-Rosler also points to society holding women to unrealistic expectations.
It's interesting that in many cultures, women are shamed for experiences which are outside their controls. And I think it has a lot to do with gender roles, that women are often held to unrealistic standards of perfection, how a woman has to be. And if they feel short of these expectations, this can lead to feelings of shame. I'm not a good wife, I'm not a good mother, thoughts like that.
Being trapped in impossible expectations was something Stefanie Knaab experienced with terrifying repercussions. Stefanie, based in Berlin, has developed a pioneering app to help victims who currently experience domestic abuse. We will hear much more about this app later in the series. Stefanie is also a survivor. When the abuse took place, she was in her early 20s, and she says society had warped her ideas of what love looked like and what was expected of her.
I mean, I was affected by physical violence, psychological violence, coercive control, sexualized violence, and a part of economic violence because he was older than me, he had more money.
Stefanie felt incredibly vulnerable. She lived with her partner, but she wasn't registered to be there. This meant she had no rights. He could have told her to leave at any minute, and there was nothing she could have done.
For example, the sexualized abuse was when he raped me. The next day, he excused himself and said, I just love you so much. I just couldn't handle myself. And I thought, that makes sense. He's so in love with me. He thinks I'm so hot and fiery that he just couldn't help himself. And the second thought was, I mean, we're in a relationship. Obviously, this is my job.
More than a decade has passed since Stefanie was raped. But she feels strongly for that former, younger version of herself. One who accepted the gaslighting and excuses her partner gave her.
And when I look back now, I mean, I'm going to be 35 this year, and I look back 12 years to my little self. I'm very heartbroken that I thought that this is okay.
According to the European Institute for Gender Equality, younger women, meaning women under 30, experience psychological violence at a higher rate than the general population, as do women with a disability or health condition, non-heterosexual women, and women with a migrant background. Stefanie's age and living situation may have made her more vulnerable and more dependent on her partner, but they're not the only reasons she accepted what he was saying. Alongside how incredibly clever and cunning abusers can be, and how incredibly effective threats and fear are in controlling women, the messages she was hearing from the abuser were echoed by society. Stefanie remembers a kindergarten teacher telling her that if a boy is mean to you, it means he likes you. She lists the wildly popular movies that romanticize and glamorize men who kidnap and control women. And she points to a culture that shames women in endless ways, which then can be used by perpetrators like her ex-boyfriend to further control and gaslight victims. After all, it's not just him who's telling her she's fat. Society is too.
It was so easy to gaslight me in this way. I mean, for example, that he said I'm not pretty enough, that there are many women who are prettier, or that I shouldn't eat that much. Like, he told me it in such a frequent way and told me he has to break up when I'm not losing weight. And I was thin. And even if I'm not thin, there is no excuse for saying that. Then just leave. If you have a problem how the way I look, then just go. But what I did is that I lost weight. And I lost so much weight that I was anorexic.
She still hears those messages, 12 years on.
Even now, I'm still looking in the mirror and I think, it's not the way I should look. It's not only based on what he said, but also what society says. I mean, we have a huge fat-shaming culture, a huge problem with how women should look like. And I think that if we would live in a society where it's not normal to romanticize abuse or not normal to comment on women's bodies, or where it's not normal and actually shamed to degrade women, I would have left earlier.
What Stefanie says next is particularly heartbreaking.
But I thought this is how a relationship should be, that I have to fight to be in this relationship. I have to earn my love.
In the end, freedom came through writing letters to herself. And I immediately think of Bridget's calendar.
My therapist at that time told me, Steffi, you need to write yourself letters. You write yourself letters every time something happens, and then you read them to yourself in good moments when you think everything is perfect, and you actually think that you remember it incorrectly. Because my abuser actually told me it's wrong, it wasn't like that. So he was really manipulative, he was gaslighting to the extreme. And at that point when I wrote myself letters, in the end it was 22, and I read them in one summer, all of them together, I realized the structure of it.
Both Stefanie, through the letters, and Bridget, through a colour-coded calendar, created the evidence of their experience. Dr. Anita Rischler-Rossler again.
You also asked, what can women do to let go of shame? I think that is very important also in psychotherapy, that the woman somehow must recognize that this shame is based on distorted beliefs rather than on objective reality.
For both Bridget and Stefanie, letting go of the shame came from recognizing what those distorted beliefs were and providing an objective reality in their place. We have heard how abusers work to undermine a victim's sense of reality. And we have also heard that the trauma caused by the abuse can do this also, compounding a victim's doubt about what did or did not take place. In both cases, Stefanie and Bridget found a way to say, look, it's real, it happened, and I can prove it. And in doing so, the shame changes side. When the images of Giselle Pellico's trial whizzed round the world, one that stuck in my mind was the long line of accused rapists waiting to enter the courtroom. Giselle's decision to waive her anonymity and allow the world to see this line of men was a type of evidence too. Look, she was telling us, look what is happening. Look at what men are doing. Look at the culture. Look at who these men are, these normal men that we all know. And again, the shame changed sides. Giselle Pellico managed to show us the scale of the problem of male violence, how entrenched this is, and how deep and wide it goes. Bridget was able to show a court of law the reality she had endured, which meant she was allowed to keep her children safe. And Stefanie was able to show herself that she was being abused. It wasn't like her boyfriend said, love doesn't have to be earned. Next time on Echoes of Harm, we meet a father who lost his daughter to male violence and started a national conversation. Plus, we discuss the undeniable influence of how the media shapes the way we see victims and survivors. If you or someone you know is impacted by the issues raised in this podcast, please know help is out there. You can find details of organisations that provide support in the podcast description. Echoes of Harm is a podcast by Cora Media in collaboration with Angelini Pharma. The podcast is written and hosted by me, Marisa Bate, with editorial support by Francesca Botenghi, editorial curation by Sarah Poma. Sound and music supervision is by Luca Micheli. Post-production and editing are done by Andrea Girelli. The graphic designer is Rebecca Grassi. The project manager is Gloria Beltrami. The producer is Martina Conte, with post-production coordination by Matteo Scelsa. Live sound engineers are Lucrezia Marcelli, Luca Possi, and Aurora Ricci.